Mitchell comes off the screens, but so does Clark. Up and in! Timely. But not for Caitlin.
93% from the free throw line, and then the three-pointer, it's just smooth as silk. She lives for these moments, and she lived up.
And the wildest part isn't even the shot itself. It's that the shot wasn't supposed to be hers. The play wasn't drawn up for her. The refs spent the whole game making her life miserable, and her own coach benched her while the Fever blew a 14-point lead. So, how does Clark end up with the ball at half court, 1 second left, and then drain it anyway? That's exactly what we're breaking down today. Let's show some love for Caitlin down in the comments. Before the Fever even tipped off against Washington, they were already carrying the weight of what happened against the Liberty. And that game still hurt in a specific way that a normal loss doesn't. Indiana was up 12 points on New York with under 4 minutes left in the third quarter. Not 2 minutes, not 4 minutes, which is an eternity in basketball terms and more than enough time to put a game away if you're doing the right things. The Fever weren't just ahead. They were controlling the game. And Clark was playing well in that stretch. So, this wasn't a situation where Indiana's best player had gone cold and the lead was fragile. The lead felt real. And then the refs started whistling and Steph White started rotating players out who had rhythm. And everything that was working just stopped. The foul trouble that piled up in those final minutes wasn't random bad luck. The whistles kept coming at the exact moments when Indiana needed to push the lead to 15 or 16. And instead, they were sending Liberty players to the line. And watching the margin shrink. White pulled players who were moving well and replaced them with lineups that slowed the offense down to nothing. And by the time anyone realized how bad it had gotten, New York was right back in it. Clark even admitted after that game that the team crumbled a little bit and that they would have liked to have played the third a little bit better and not let them beat back in the game, which is a pretty measured way of describing what was honestly some horrible basketball down the stretch. Fans weren't just upset about the loss itself. Losing hurts, but it's normal. You move on. What made this one different is that Indiana lost a game they were clearly winning, and two separate things caused it. Officiating that kept stopping Indiana's momentum at the worst times and a coaching staff that couldn't hold a 12-point lead with 4 minutes left. Those two things together don't just cost you a game, they follow you into the next one because the team now knows that a comfortable lead can disappear fast if the refs turn against you and the rotations go sideways. So, the Fever landed in Washington to face a Mystics team that was young, inconsistent, and still trying to figure out its own identity. On paper, this was exactly the kind of game Indiana should handle without drama. The Mystics weren't a team built to test Clark or Boston or any of the Fever's strengths. And Indiana was clearly the more talented roster. That should have meant a clean win, a chance to exhale, a chance to prove the Liberty game was just one bad night. But the thing about a team that just blew a 12-point lead because of soft rotations and bad calls, is that the same tendencies don't just disappear in the next game. The patterns were still there. White's late-game decision-making hadn't changed overnight. The refs in this league weren't suddenly going to start calling things fairly for Indiana. And the players who kept making the wrong read at the wrong time were all still in the same rotation. Clark described her team crumbling against the Liberty. And that word is pretty accurate for what happened. You don't uncrumble in 48 hours just because the opponent is younger and less experienced. The fact that Indiana nearly lost to Washington anyway and only survived because Clark launched a 31-footer at the buzzer tells you the crumbling wasn't a one-game thing. The first half looked almost too clean. And if you were watching, you know exactly what that feeling was. That okay, this is the game Indiana needed feeling where everything clicks and the lead just keeps growing. Clark was moving without the ball, finding gaps, getting into her spots, and Aaliyah Boston was doing what Boston does when she's locked in, catching feeds in the post, finishing through contact, and just refusing to let Washington's interior stop her. The Fever built the lead all the way to 17 at one point. And at halftime, they were up 43-29, which sounds comfortable because it was comfortable. Boston's final line of 14 points and 10 rebounds tells you a lot about how that first half went, because a double-double like that against a young Mystics team means Indiana was running their offense through her consistently and she was delivering every time. She grabbed loose balls, held her ground in the paint and gave the Fever a reliable option whenever the perimeter stuff wasn't there. Lexi Hull was doing the quiet stuff on the other end, staying attached to her assignment, taking charges, and turning Washington possessions into nothing before they even got started. Hull's defense in that first half gave Indiana stops. They needed to keep pushing the lead up. And those plays don't show up in a box score, but they absolutely kept Washington from climbing back in during the second quarter, where Indiana outscored them 22-13. Then the third quarter started and the offense just died. Not slowed down, not sputtered, died. You could feel it before the scoreboard even caught up. That grinding, nothing is moving feeling when a team loses its pace completely and every possession becomes a struggle. Kelsey Mitchell kept holding the ball in spots where the right pass was right there in front of her. Clark cutting, Boston posting, and instead of hitting either one in rhythm, Mitchell would either pull up for her own shot or dribble the clock down until the possession turned into nothing. And it happened enough times in a row that Washington started genuinely believing they could erase 14 points, which against Indiana, against this roster, they absolutely should not have believed. But bad offense has a way of making bad teams feel good about themselves, and the Mystics fed off every stalled Fever possession. White's rotations in the second half didn't help. The lineups that had been clicking in the first half kept getting broken up, and Clark's foul trouble gave White the excuse to bench her at exactly the moment Indiana needed someone to create, which meant the Fever's offense was running through people who couldn't generate the same things Clark generates. Clark picking up fouls wasn't random either, because the refs were calling the game tight in a way that kept interrupting Indiana's rhythm. And Boston and Mitchell both picked up foul trouble, too. So, the Fever's best players kept getting pulled or playing cautious when Washington was right there sniffing a comeback. By the fourth quarter, the 14-point cushion was completely gone. Shakira Austin dropped in a layup to give Washington a 74-73 lead with under a minute left. And then Sonia Citroen hit both free throws to make it 76-75 with 4.3 seconds remaining. And the team that had looked completely in control at halftime was now trailing, scrambling, and playing without any coherent plan on offense. White hadn't drawn up anything that was actually solving the problem. The structure that was supposed to protect a lead that big had completely broken down. And with 4.3 seconds left and the Fever down 1, someone had to do something the coaching staff hadn't planned for. Down 1 point, 4.3 seconds left. And Indiana calls timeout to draw something up. Whatever White sketched on that whiteboard, it wasn't a 31-foot heave from Caitlin Clark. Some accounts point to Kelsey Mitchell as the intended target. Others describe a sequence that was supposed to generate something closer to the basket, but Clark wasn't the designed finisher on that play. That much seems pretty clear from how the whole thing unfolded. Sophie Cunningham took the inbound. She caught it, looked up, and instead of swinging it to whoever White had drawn the arrow toward, she fired a cross-court pass to Clark near half-court with 1 second on the clock. That's not a design play. That's Cunningham reading the floor in real time and making a decision that most players in that moment simply don't make, because most players in that moment are thinking about the play they were told to run, not the one that's actually available. Clark caught it without hesitation. 1 second left, 31 feet from the basket, and she just pulled up and launched it. And the ball went in, and the Fever won 78-76. There's no dramatic way to say that. It just happened. And it worked. And Indiana escaped a game they had almost completely given away. What's worth sitting with is how Cunningham knew that pass was a real read, not a lucky throw. Because you don't make that decision unless you genuinely believe your teammate will catch a cross-court pass at half-court after a timeout and immediately fire a shot from that distance without even thinking about it. Cunningham trusted Clark to do something that almost no player in this league can actually do. And Clark rewarded that trust by doing it cleanly. That kind of connection doesn't come from a practice drill. It builds over a season of playing together, watching each other, knowing what the other person does when the game gets tight. Teammates described it afterward as quick reads and on-court instinct, which is accurate and also a pretty polite way of saying the design play broke down and Clark and Cunningham just fixed it on the fly. Hull and others talked about it like it was almost natural. Like, of course, that's how it ended. Which tells you something about how this group thinks about Clark in those moments, even if the coaching staff's late-game designs don't always reflect it. That's the part that keeps nagging. Clark's biggest moments in 2026 keep coming from situations where she and her teammates improvise around the system rather than through it. The game winner against Washington wasn't built in a huddle. It happened because Cunningham ignored the script and trusted her instincts, and it worked, which is great. But it also raises a real question about whether White's late-game sets are actually designed with Clark's specific abilities in mind. Because a player who can hit a 31-footer off one dribble probably shouldn't be the option that gets discovered by accident. Clark talked after the game about her fire and her competitiveness being non-negotiable, about how that intensity is just part of who she is and she's not interested in dialing it back. And watching that last possession, you completely understand what she means, because the same thing that drives her in press conferences when she pushes back on criticism is the exact same thing that made her catch that pass and shoot without a single moment of doubt. She didn't look the ball into her hands. She didn't take a gather step to think about it. She just caught and fired from 31 feet with the game on the line. And the Fever season stayed alive because of it. Clark walked into that post-game press conference carrying the kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. And the critics who'd spent weeks telling her to calm down and dial back her emotion got their answer in the form of a 31-feet game winner off an unplanned pass with 1 second left. The narrative around her intensity had been building for a while, with people framing her competitiveness as a problem to manage rather than a reason Indiana wins close games. Too emotional, too reactive, too much fire for a player who's supposed to be a composed leader. Clark's response to all of that wasn't defensive or apologetic. She pushed back clearly. The emotion and the performance aren't two separate things. Music, you don't get to have one without the other. And the same fire that makes people uncomfortable in press conferences is exactly what put that ball through the net at the buzzer. You want the shot, you take the whole person. Steph White stepped to the podium and called Clark a generational player. Talked about how the moment could build Clark's confidence and push the team's momentum forward through the rest of 2026. And the praise sounded genuine enough. But it sat right next to the memory of White benching Clark during the fourth quarter collapse, pulling her off the floor while Washington erased a 14-point lead, which is a hard contradiction to just move past. You can't bench someone during a collapse and then call them generational in the press conference without people doing the math on those two things together. Cunningham talked about the final pass in a way that felt completely unscripted, describing the connection with Clark in those last seconds as something built over months of playing together, not something you diagram on a whiteboard. And that's probably the most honest explanation of how that possession worked. Because Cunningham didn't throw that pass because a coach told her to. She threw it because she knew, music, from a full season of watching Clark, that Clark would catch it clean and shoot it without hesitating. That kind of trust gets built over time through shared reps and shared pressure. And it showed up exactly when Indiana needed it most. The broader picture of the Fever after this win is still pretty messy, though. One buzzer beater doesn't repair the defensive breakdowns that kept Washington in the game, or the ball movement issues that stalled the offense for an entire half, or the rotation decisions that kept disrupting lineups that were actually working. Those problems were real against the Liberty, Music, and they showed up again against Washington. And a 78-76 win over a young Mystics team doesn't make them disappear. Boston's 14 points and 10 rebounds in a win is exactly the kind of production Indiana needs from her regularly, because, Music, when she's healthy and not in foul trouble, she changes what the Fever can do on both ends of the floor. The foul trouble that pulled her out of rhythm in the second half is a real issue the team needs to solve, not manage around, because Indiana can't keep asking Clark to bail them out with half-court shots while Boston sits on the bench with 4 fouls. Music. Hull kept doing the quiet things that don't get mentioned in game recaps. Staying in front of her assignment, taking charges, turning Washington possessions into nothing. She doesn't need the spotlight to affect a game, which is exactly the kind of player a team needs when everything else is breaking down. The Fever won by 2 points on a shot that wasn't drawn up for Clark off a pass Cunningham improvised in real time. And without that one unplanned moment, Indiana loses 2 straight games to teams they should have beaten comfortably. Indiana won by 2 points on a shot that wasn't drawn up off a pass that wasn't in the playbook from a player White had benched during the same collapse. That's not a feel-good story. That's a team surviving its own dysfunction by the thinnest possible margin. Clark is the reason Indiana has a real shot in 2026. And the gap between what she's capable of and what White actually builds for her is the one thing the Fever have to fix before the games start mattering more. Let's show some love for Caitlin down in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications as we're bringing you all the action and top stories. Click the video on the screen and we'll see you in the next.